And now, coming to you live from the label lynching headquarters, this is Half Baked News with your half serious host, Mark Herr.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Center for Self-Governance presentation on the political weaponization of labels in government, how Americans become unwitting domestic terrorists. My name is Mark Herr. I'm the president of CSG. We started this research on PWAL back in 2010 after our Congressman Steve Cohen in Tennessee labeled us clones of George Wallace and that we had forgotten our white sheets and robes. For me, this was a wake-up call on the political weaponization of labels in government. And since then, we've made tremendous discoveries about how labels are weaponized and how government uses those labels to silence political participation of all Americans across the entire United States. Our presentation is going to cover 5 sections. The first 4 sections are related to labels that are perpetuating public confusion and putting U.S. citizens in danger, legal definitions that are loosely defined and ambiguous, resulting in threat assessments and tags where this process is not due process at all, and interdiction where law enforcement are having a hard time themselves differentiating between criminals or enemies. Our final section is going to result in solutions. How do we fix this political weaponization of labels and government cycle? So let's get started. We'll start with labels. We're going to label this white, hate, anti-government, terrorist, extremist, or hate labels. It means one thing or another to the public, to the media, to non-government organizations, and to law enforcement officers across the entire United States. Problem number 1. There are inconsistent public personas of who actually is a white, hate, anti-government, terrorist extremist. For example, earlier this year, Larry Elders in California was labeled the new face, the black face of white supremacy. Mayra Flores from Texas was labeled a Republican extremist or the new Hispanic face of white supremacy. Muslims protesting critical race theory curriculum in Michigan were labeled the new face of white supremacy, and Asians have been categorized in the school district as white adjacent. This inconsistent public persona of who is a hate or who fits these hate labels is inconsistent across the entire United States. The media using W-hate labeling is defined differently than government lexicons. In 2018, I had a text message exchange with Inlander journalist Dan Walters. And in our exchange, I basically called him out on using these W-hate labeling for Center for Self-Governance. I asked him to retract this. He wouldn't give his definitions, or he wouldn't say that his definitions were poor, or he wouldn't clarify the fact that his labels did not match federal lexicon definitions. This was troubling to us because the federal lexicon definitions were the same labels that he was using. But he was making the case that his lexicon or his definitions did not match the federal lexicons. We asked him for clarification, and to this day, he has refused to clarify that our organization does not fit the federal definitions and labels that he's using privately in his media journalism. The third problem is that media W-hate labeling perpetuates public confusion and places American citizens in danger. We refer to this phenomena at CSG as the political weaponization of labels. Here's an example. In North Dakota, a private citizen ran over another private citizen and told the police he did it because he thought that this teenager was a Republican extremist or part of a Republican extremist group. Recently, the Club Q attack, where the individual attacked and shot and killed people at a gay bar, Pundits came out who call themselves extremism experts, said that this threat has been going on for decades. However, the shooting suspect, according to the defense attorney, was non-binary. This had nothing to do with so-called right-wing extremism.
On this, we are now joined by GLAD President and CEO Sarah Kate Ellis. We were talking last hour how the FBI hate crimes report, which comes out, the most recent one in 2020, said 20% of hate crimes were against the LGBTQ community. Why is it, do you think, we are seeing this increase in hate crimes targeting the community?
Yeah, I think it's driven by two things primarily. One is the rhetoric that's coming out from politicians, and then couple that with social media platforms that are monetizing hate. So it's incredibly frustrating to see something like Saturday night happen when you know what's driving it. Whatever the motive comes out to be, we know that there is an increase in this culture of hate and rhetoric around our community that is resulting in real world harm.
So here you see the media perpetuating public confusion. This tragedy, this crime of mass shooting people was not committed by hate group or right-wing extremists or whoever the media is labeling. It's perpetuated by somebody who was a part of that community who decided that he was going to kill all those people. And this places Americans in danger. Here's an example. In Texas, the LGBTQ community is now arming themselves to fight against right-wing extremists. So here we see the media perpetuating this false narrative that this crime was committed because of hate or committed because of a right-wing extremist group or because of political rhetoric. Problem number 4, unseen and unknown non-government organizations are colluding with media, academia, corporations, and law enforcement to perpetuate this W-hate labeling. For example, the Southern Poverty Law Center, capitalizing on the Colorado Springs mass shooting, says that far-right influencers made LGBTQ people into targets. Again, perpetuating the media's public confusion, now tied to a non-government organization that you've probably never heard of before, labeling far right as the reason for the so-called hate crime, when in fact it's a crime committed by a mass shooter with an axe to grind. Notice that on the Southern Poverty Law Center's website, they use the word hate and extremism, and that they say that they're going to monitor these hate groups and these extremists throughout the United States and expose their activities to the public, to the media, and to law enforcement. In their website, they have this tab called Extremist Files, where they say that they're going to contain profiles of prominent extremists, extremist organizations, and all types of extremist movements. Under their Extremism Files ideologies, they label white nationalist alongside anti-government in general. Anti-government in general, they list in terms of tied to sovereign citizens, militia, the federal government is tyrannical, is illegitimate, etc. And then they have an anti-government map where they list all of the so-called anti-government groups that they have labeled along with extremism, hate, anti-LGBTQ, and far right. Now remember, the journalist above, Dan Walters, labeled Center for Self-Governance far right. We asked him for a retraction, but he wouldn't. To this day, it's still not retracted. And now Southern Poverty Law Center, a non-government organization, is labeled Center for Self-Governance as anti-government. Problem number 5, non-government organizations W-hate labeling perpetuates public confusion and places American citizens in danger. Southern Poverty Law Center is a member of the Amazon Smiles charity board, and Amazon Smile, because they labeled us anti-government, canceled our Amazon charity status because of SPLC labeling us anti-government. Now you can see the media perpetuates the public confusion. It causes danger to the American public. And here we have Southern Poverty Law Center labeling an organization like ours anti-government. We get canceled on our charity program. And as a result, Our students across the nation ask us what's going on, why we were donating to you through Amazon's charity, the Amazon Smile program. What's going on? Why have you been canceled? Worse than that.
In 2012, just across the hall there, a deranged man broke in to the Family Research Council and tried to shoot every single person in the building. Floyd Corkins told the FBI that he targeted the Family Research Council because the Southern Poverty Law Center called it an anti-gay group.
So notice the Family Research Council, this is in 2012, they experienced a mass shooting because they were listed on their hate list, under their extremism files, under anti-government, anti-LGBTQ. Is the same fate going to happen to Center for Self-Governance as a result of being listed on all of their lists, etc., perpetuating these W hate labels? Listen to the mass shooter himself.
Now, how did you, this building, this organization, how did you find it early? Did you look it up online, or how did you know about it?
Southern Poverty Law lists anti-gay groups. I found them online.
Okay.
A little bit of research on their website and stuff like that.
Okay.
So here you see the mass shooter admitting he went to the Southern Poverty Law Center. He found them on the list. Okay. You have LGBTQ communities arming themselves to fight right-wing extremists. So the public confusion with the media narratives that are perpetuating this confusion, and then Southern Poverty Law Center labeling you, W hate labeling, causing mass shooters, causing Amazon Smile to cancel you. This is a massive problem in the United States, and it needs to be stopped. It needs to be prevented, and the reason why is because we can see this happening through other NGOs unknown to the American people that perpetuate this W hate labeling. Political Research Associates, Challenging the Right, Countering Extremism, Institute for Research on Human Rights, Tea Party Nationalism, Institute for Strategic Dialogues, Powering Solutions to Extremism and Hate. Even the United Nations having their council committee on countering violent extremism and terrorism. Why is this so important? Because these labels, once they become weaponized, in the public sphere, it creates public confusion. You end up with dead teens in North Dakota. You end up being canceled by Amazon Smile, and you end up with mass shooters coming to your Family Research Council to kill all of you. More so than that is what happens when this gets weaponized in government. Problem number 6, law enforcement W hate labeling overlaps public confusion, media narratives, and non-government organization labeling. Let me show you how. We refer to this phenomena as the political weaponization of government. In the Department of Homeland Extremism lexicon, which I referred to Dan Waters in the text thread earlier, it states the patriot movement is a term used by right-wing extremists to link their beliefs to these commonly associated with the American Revolution. Recall that Dan Waters referred to Center for Self-Governance as the patriot movement, so there's overlap. Right? The DHS lexicon refers to the patriot movement, but Dan Waters says our lexicon is not the DHS lexicon, but he labels us patriot movement. It says that we're commonly associated with the American Revolution, and the patriot movement primarily comprises violent anti-government groups such as militias, sovereign citizens, Christian patriots, patriot group, constitutionalists, and constitutionalists. Again, I want to make sure you understand the label overlaps what Dan Walters referred to as Patriot Movement for Center for Self-Governance, as well as the DHS lexicon, but they say that they don't use the same definitions. That's dangerous. In page 8 of the same lexicon, it states that right-wing extremism, which Dan Walters referred to us as far right, Southern Poverty Law Center refers to far right influencers, right-wing extremists, right? Says a movement of right-wing groups or individuals who can be broadly divided into those who are primarily hate-oriented, those who are mainly anti-government, those who reject federal authority. Now remember, we asked Dan Walters to clarify to his constituent readers that his definitions do not match the federal definitions, and he even admits that. and that a clarification in his story about Center for Self-Governance, we are not hate-oriented, we are not anti-government, as we are accused of being by Southern Poverty Law Center, and we do not reject federal authority in favor of state and local authority. And so their clarification in the media is non-existent. Southern Poverty Law Center can label you anti-government, but inside the federal lexicon, they have the same exact labels. So there's a problem with the overlap between the public confusion, the media narratives, non-government organization like SPLC labeling, and these federal lexicons. They say that they don't match. They're right. However, their clarifications in their media and on their websites and in their list, it puts us in danger of being canceled. It puts us in danger of being threatened, like they're going to fight us now. And it puts us in danger of mass shooters actually showing up to kill us. This is extremely dangerous. We need to deal with the W-hate labeling immediately through congressional action, through state action, and through local actions. But before we get to that, we need to show you how this is perpetuated. This pipeline is perpetuated in the federal statutes. So we're going to transition to our second section on definitions. We're going to talk about international versus domestic terrorism language. It means one thing or another in the law, and it means one thing or another to law enforcement, and that is dangerous. We need consistent definitions in federal, state, and local laws. So who do federal terrorism definitions apply to? If you're called a white, hate, anti-government, terrorist, extremist, who do federal terrorism legal definitions actually apply to? Do they apply in the media? Are they the same at Southern Poverty Law Center? Are they the same in the federal statutes? Let's find out. In Title 18, Section 921, it says that terrorism is an activity committed by a non-U.S. citizen, and that it involves violent acts that are dangerous to human life and is intended to do three things: intimidate or coerce a civilian population, to influence the policy of government by intimidation or coercion, and to affect the conduct of government by assassination or kidnapping. Now notice, in this federal law, terrorism applies to non-U.S. citizens. Now, if we look at other terrorism laws, which we're going to do really quick here, we notice in Title 18, Section 2331, Part 1, International Terrorism, it uses the exact same language, but it changes the language from is intended in 921 to appear to be intended in 231. It uses the same terrorist activities, but notice that it doesn't identify who this definition applies to. Same for Title 18, 23031, Part 5, domestic terrorism. Notice it uses the same language, appear to be intended. It has the same terrorist activities, but again, it does not define who does this definition apply to. The same for Title 6 under the Domestic Security or the Department of Homeland Security Act. Notice that it has the same exact language as the previous two, but it does not identify who federal terrorism definitions apply to. This is very dangerous because this can be left to interpretation by federal law enforcement agencies. Can they start changing the definition beyond a non-US citizen committing an act of terrorism to people like me, president of the Center for Self-Governance, where I'm labeled far right by journalist Dan Waters, where Southern Poverty Law Center labels our organization anti-government, that matches the federal lexicon on extremism, but they say that they're not the same. What protections do I or Center for Self-Governance or our students or for you, the American public, have if it's not clear in these federal laws? Who do these federal terrorism definitions actually apply to? Some other problems with this. Who gets to define appears to be intended? What happens when you have a bureaucrat who doesn't agree with you politically? Can they now weaponize the government because you appear to be intended? Let's take, for example, if you don't agree with the Supreme Court on abortion and you go protest at a Supreme Court justice's house, What happens if you have people that don't agree with you in the federal government who say that you appear to be intended to be a domestic terrorist, extremist, white, anti-government terrorist? Or if you're an election integrity questioner, like in Arizona or in Washington, D.C., what if you say, I don't agree with the election integrity, and you become violent? Do you appear to be intended to be a domestic terrorist, white, anti-government, extremist, hate group? But if you show up to Supreme Court justices' homes and you're not arrested, you don't appear to be intended to be a white, hate, anti-government terrorist, extremist? It all depends on who is in control of the government and gets to define appears to be intended. That can flip-flop at any given moment when somebody new takes control of the government reins. Problem number 9, when is intimidate or coerce a civilian population not terrorism? In 2020, hundreds of thousands of businesses were burned to the ground or damaged because of the George Floyd event. Many of the police withheld their law enforcement because they were concerned about what? Were not those protesters intimidating and coercing a civilian population? Is that not terrorism? Or if you show up in Washington, D.C. on January 6th, are you intimidating and coercing the civilian population and that is terrorism? Again, it's very important that our federal laws define who terrorism applies to and is not left to interpretation by bureaucrats who may have political agendas. Problem 10, when is intimidate the policy of government by intimidation or coercion not terrorism? Again, I'm going to refer back to January 6th and the protesters at Supreme Court justices' homes. When is intimidating the policy of government on election integrity? Is that now terrorism? And then protesting Supreme Court justices on abortion in the Dobbs case, that's not terrorism? Again, my point is when bureaucrats or elected officials who do not share the same political beliefs as you are in control of government, will this definition change depending on who's in control of government? That is a very dangerous precedent, and it is something that all Americans should be very deeply concerned about. It's important that we clarify who do federal terrorism designations and definitions apply to in the United States. Right now, problem 11, U.S. citizens can be investigated and jailed for domestic terrorism, but not charged unless you have a connection to a Department of State designated foreign terrorist organization. So this is where the lines get confusing. Listen very carefully.
Mr. McGarity, the FBI considers preventing terrorism its #1 priority. Isn't that right?
That is correct.
We've seen white supremacist attacks that were clearly domestic terrorism. At this hearing, we discovered through expert witness testimony that not all of these incidents seem to be treated with the similar consistency. You're saying that AME was charged with domestic terrorism, Dylan Roof.
So you're using the word charge. So as I said before, there's no domestic terrorism charge like 18 U.S.C. 2339 A, B, C, D for a foreign terrorist organization. Some of the definitions we're using, I think we're talking past each other.
But the actual charge, was the actual charge domestic terrorism?
You're not going to find an actual charge of domestic terrorism out there.
Well, it says here that, but at the San Bernardino shooting or the Orlando Pulse nightclub shooting, they were designated and charged as domestic terrorist incidents.
They were charged likely with, if there was a connection to a foreign terrorist organization, but worked as an international terrorist because he was following under the definition.
But he was homegrown and self-radicalized.
Extremist cases, how we work homegrown violent extremist cases under the global jihad, we worked under international terrorism. That is correct.
Is white supremacy not a global issue?
It is a global issue.
So why are they not charged with foreign
Because the United States Congress doesn't have a statute for us for domestic terrorism like we do on a foreign terrorist organization like ISIS, Al-Qaeda, Al-Shabaab.
This is extremely disconcerting because what happens if Antifa, because Antifa is a global organization, it's a global, some people would say it's a global problem. White supremacy is a global problem. So what happens when you start to create a domestic terrorism charge in the United States for US citizens? And I just want to stress this point. When you create a domestic terrorism charge for US citizens, it goes both ways. It depends on who is in control of the government and what their political agenda is. If you have people that disagree with you and they're in charge of these definitions, then they can weaponize this against you. And I'm going to repeat, we asked Dan Waters to clarify to his readers that his personal definition of far right and the federal definition of far right did not match, and that Center for Self-Governance does not match the federal definition of right-wing extremists. Southern Poverty Law Center, we are in the process of taking action to get them to rescind their label of anti-government because we do not follow the federal extremism lexicon's definition of hate, anti-government, and rejecting federal authority. And so again, my point is this, is when you have a political ideologue in charge of the government definitions and designations, do you want domestic terrorism charges for US citizens, regardless of their beliefs? Our organization is strongly against creating domestic terrorism charges against any American citizen based on this notion that whoever's in control of the government, depending on their political beliefs, can then turn the government into a weapon against the American citizens. That is a major problem. Problem 12, there are too many definitions for terrorism that differ from the charging statutes, as pointed out by the counterterrorism director McClarty. It exacerbates public confusion, and it exacerbates law enforcement interdiction against regular American citizens. For example, in Title 18, Section 113B, this is what McClarty was referring to, 2339B, where it talks about designated foreign terrorist organizations. Notice number 2 and 3, where it talks about the organization engaging in terrorist activity. Number 3, organization engaging in terrorism. These are 2 additional statutes on the definition of terrorism, but notice it's not ambiguous like the previous ones where they don't identify who it applies to. These apply to non-US citizens or US citizens who are connected to a designated terrorist organization. So in order for you to be charged with domestic terrorism, you have to be connected to a foreign terrorist organization, or you have to be a non-US citizen who is committing an act of terrorism based on those federal statutes. The other 3 laws do not define who that applies to. Serious problem for us to resolve in the coming years. The definitions or the designation for terrorist organization is assigned to the Secretary of State of the Department of State. Notice in B, again, there's 2 terrorist activities defined in a law and then terrorism in another law, but these are related to foreign terrorist organizations committed by non-US citizens or US citizens who are connected to those foreign terrorist organizations. This is problem 13. If the domestic terrorism definitions and charges are not clarified, is the Department of State going to begin designating domestic terrorist organizations inside the United States? That is deeply troubling when you consider Dan Waters will not retract his far-right labeling of Center for Self-Governance and admits it doesn't match the federal lexicon. Southern Poverty Law Center can label our organization anti-government, but yet we do not match the federal definition of extremists. And so at what point, if we don't clarify this definition, are individuals like myself or organizations like Center for Self-Governance going to be classified as domestic terrorist or domestic terrorist organizations by the Department of State? What is our remedy? What is our protection against such an action? Problem 14. Department of Justice, FBI, DHS, Department of Homeland Security use the terms domestic terrorism and domestic violent extremist interchangeably. They do this as though the foreign terrorist organization connection is not required. But according to the law, it is required under Title 18-921 and under those others various statutes under the Secretary of State, as well as Title 239B regarding designated foreign terrorist organizations. And so this is deeply troubling when they are changing the definitions and now using labels themselves. Here's our point. DHS and FBI have a joint standards for domestic terrorism and for tracking incidents of domestic terrorism. And they did this at the request of the FBI, Homeland Security, and in consultation with the Director of National Intelligence. Okay, the Director of National Intelligence. Notice that they say in their document, they use the term domestic terrorism interchangeably with domestic violent extremist. Why is this a problem? This is a problem because is there an attempt being made to create a designation for domestic terrorism organization in the United States without a connection to Department of State designated foreign terrorist organization? Again, I'm going to repeat. Journalist Dan Walters labels Center for Self-Governance far right. We ask for a retraction because it doesn't match the federal lexicon. Southern Poverty Law Center labels our organization anti-government. We don't match the federal lexicon for extremism. We're not a hate group. We are not anti-government, and we do not reject federal authority. So watch, you'll see here. This is the Department of National, Director of National Intelligence in consultation with the previous memo on interchangeable use of DVE and domestic terrorism labels. And in their categories of domestic violent extremists, DVEs, it says domestic violent extremists are US-based actors. Now, they don't clarify that they're connected to a foreign terrorist organization. They just say that they're committing Title 18, 230.31.5 domestic terrorism activities. Now, look at the labels here. Notice how it matches. 4 of the 5 sound very similar to the Southern Poverty Law Center's ideological-based extremism. Racially and ethnically motivated extremists, abortion-related extremists, anti-government, anti-authority, violent extremists, and all other domestic terrorism threats. So this creates the impression that U.S. actors do not have to be connected to a foreign terrorist organization committing Section 921 terrorist activities, intimidating, coercing a civilian population, intimidating, coercing government policy, and affecting the conduct of government. They're literally creating this impression that myself and Center for Self-Governance can be labeled far right because the media has labeled us that, even though we asked for a retraction. Southern Poverty Law Center, which we're in the process of doing that, labeling us anti-government. It all depends on who's in control of the government at the time and their political belief systems. If they don't agree with you, they now not only have the tools in place to surveil you, they have the tools in place to treat you as an enemy of the United States. That's a huge problem. Problem 16, unequal application of domestic violent extremists and domestic terrorism labeling undermines public trust in law enforcement, and it causes unnecessary political division. I have to be honest with you. It makes me like, do I trust my law enforcement and the government that I teach in Center for Self-Governance? Do I like how do I navigate that? It creates a cognitive dissonance, and so it's really important that we reestablish trust in our law enforcement and that we eliminate this unnecessary political division. When you see the treatment of those rioting in 2020, burning down thousands of businesses in the name of George Floyd, and the media portraying that as peaceful protest, and Southern Poverty Law Center not covering it on their website, that smacks of political bias to me. When you see the law enforcement agents withholding their efforts on the protest and federal takeover of a federal building in Portland, Oregon, or you see a gentleman named William Von Spronson trying to kill federal agents and blow up federal buildings in Tacoma, Washington. But the media, Southern Poverty Law Center, as well as federal law enforcement treating it differently than, say, January 6 election integrity protesters or others protesting ranching and land use regulations, and the treatment is different. It undermines public trust in law enforcement, and it causes unnecessary political division in the United States. It is a serious problem and something that we all need to work together to fix. Okay, I'm going to turn this over to Mila Woods, who's going to talk about threat assessments and threat tags.
Thanks, Mark. Okay. Hi, thanks, Mark. You can see here's a list of threat assessments and threat tag, I guess, things that are really loosely defined and do not have sideboards within law. Next slide. So problem 17, federal and state laws are weak or non-existent regarding domestic terrorism versus foreign terrorist organization designation and distinctions. And threat assessment checks and balances are also missing in law, which is a problem for the American public. This interagency threat assessment coordination group, they are completely made up of unelected, unaccountable bureaucrats, which you can see here. We have a department, a bureau, a center, a department, and then other entities as appropriate. So there's no one elected that's really going to be accountable to the American public. Next. And then here we have one of our accountability entities, FACA. It says here that the Interagency Threat Assessment Coordination Group isn't accountable, and that this doesn't apply to them. So again, transparency is really a problem for the American citizen in threat assessments. Next. So problem 18, ambiguous definitions of domestic violent extremism and domestic terrorism and designations are mixed into state and local law enforcement. And we refer to this entire complicated and confusing phenomena as the political weaponization of government. And here we can see the Fusion Center references the nationwide SAR initiative, Suspicious Activity Reporting Initiative. So thinking back on Mark's presentation on loose definitions and subjective things in our laws and in threat assessments, what is suspicious activity? But it is a joint collaborative effort by the U.S. Department of Homeland Security, the Federal Bureau of Investigation, and the state, local, tribal, and territorial law enforcement partners. So now we have all of these words and these loose definitions being mixed together in every level of government, which I think makes it even more difficult to untie. So whether a plan for a terrorist attack is homegrown or originates overseas, and again, no clarification, is there a foreign terrorist organization distinction? Important knowledge that may forewarn of a future attack may be derived from information gathered by state, local, and tribal government personnel in the course of routine law enforcement and other activities. So again, we have loose definitions, we have unclear law, and now they're sending it all throughout law enforcement in every level of government, and the citizens just simply have no real protection from this. Next.
Just want to reiterate what Mila said here related to the protections. So you have the DHS and the FBI and the Director of National Intelligence essentially creating this interchangeable definition between domestic violent extremist and domestic terrorism. And as a result, we don't have who does domestic terrorism apply to. So you can see them using that language, Mila, where they're saying U.S. actors without a connection to a foreign terrorist organization or being a non-U.S. citizen. And so that not only gives them a lot of investigative tools, but that gives them broad bandwidth to start targeting U.S. citizens who are labeled by the media like Dan Waters, who get labeled by SPLC like CSG and anti-government, and others who've experienced this. So in your opinion, Mila, the above DVE and DT designation process, that's not due process, is it?
No, it's definitely not due process. And especially when you look at our problem 19, the above DVE and DT designation process is not due process. because we've seen it. We've seen it in real time. So we've seen it with real citizens, and I think the next slide will show us.
Well, I wanted to bring in Zoe real quick to ask him about this as well. Zoe, are you there? Can you give us your feedback on how the above pipeline process is not due process?
Sure, absolutely. Due process of law would indicate some kind of adjudication. It would indicate some kind of labeling that is given the benefit of jurisprudence, jury of your peers, judicial insight, and some kind of judgment that's not just kind of a bureaucrat labeling you non-government, non-governmental organization who train those law enforcement officers to use these labels to define certain people. And so what can happen is people that are involved in their political participation can be labeled something based on the whim of anybody. It doesn't have to even be nefarious. It can just be assumptive. And because of those assumptions, someone's entire life can get turned upside down for being at the wrong place at the wrong time with the wrong label. It happened, obviously, it's in the media. It happened to me. I got a visit from the Joint Terrorism Task Force of the FBI because I was expressing my political participation, being unhappy with how the 2020 elections went. As a reporter, I went to DC to report on what was going to happen with the electoral vote count. And so I'm there with my camera reporting for the Standard SC. A year later, I get a visit from the FBI. And they didn't want to have anything to do with any of the footage that I shot. They didn't want to look through not 1 minute of it. I had put my report out just 5 days later, after January 6, 2021. But, February of 2022, they're standing in my doorway just trying to figure out how close I got to the Capitol. Did I get inside? They were there to investigate me for what
domestic violent extremist who is a U.S. actor that fits under Title 18, Section 5, intimidate or coerce a government policy. That's why they're there.
And with a card that says terrorism on it, which does not, I'm not committing terrorism. To me, I was following in line with what I had heard from our former president, Barack Obama, our current vice president, Kamala Harris, saying that it was 1776 and we should not, it's the American Revolution, we shouldn't stop to get our government to do what is right. And that's what she said about the 2020 protesters. And so with that encouragement, we went forward and then we're labeled terrorists.
Mila, do you have any follow-up regarding what Zoe's saying? And then we'll continue.
Yeah, I think it's a really good example. The label can get you, and it's a bureaucratic label. It's a subjective label that has no basis in law, but then we're sending out law enforcement, which is intimidating to the average everyday American citizen who actually probably tries to avoid any interactions with the FBI, let alone with the Joint Terrorism Task Force.
Exactly. All right. So now we're going to give some more practical examples about how this above DVE and DT designation process is not due process. Please follow along. So problem 20, what's the difference between a criminal and an enemy of the United States? Under the circumstances that we presented to you guys earlier, that line is ambiguously defined. This is Lavoy Finicum. He was a rancher who was shot and killed in 2016, January. He was labeled white, hate, anti-government, terrorist, extremist multiple times. The government was weaponized. The FBI used the domestic violent extremism U.S. actor, Title 18 domestic terrorism, to convince the Oregon State Patrol that they had a national security threat and that he needed to be stopped and killed on his way to a town hall meeting in Grant County, Oregon. He was shot at 6 times before he was shot in the back 3 times. And that's what you do to an enemy of the United States. Speaking as somebody who's a former military member, you shoot at your enemy first and you ask questions later. Versus William von Spronson, who was shot and killed in Tacoma, Washington, because he was trying to kill federal agents. So he's trying to take over a federal building in Tacoma, Washington. In this case, the media labeled him a social justice warrior. And you can see that he referred to himself as I am Antifa, which again, I would say to those on both the left and the right, Antifa is a global so-called problem, just like white supremacy. Maybe they would disagree. However, William von Spronson was treated like a social justice hero and a criminal, not an enemy of the United States, like Lavoy Finicum. Even though both of them were killed by law enforcement officers, the labeling was different in the media and Southern Poverty Law Center. They did not cover William von Spronson as an extremist in Southern Poverty Law Center. Only Lavoy Finicum for being white, hate, anti-government, terrorist, extremist, social justice warrior. And all I can say is this is a huge problem if we can't clarify the definition between what a criminal and an enemy of the United States is, especially amongst ourselves as U.S. citizens. Mila, I'm going to turn this over to you for problem 21.
Okay, yeah, so, and I guess in regards to who is an enemy of the state, you know, what are the rules of engagement? And I think that's where we would probably go next. But problem 21, a U.S. citizen can unknowingly receive an official threat tag or label leading to an official threat assessment based on ambiguous domestic violent extremists and domestic terrorism definitions and designations without being connected to a foreign terrorist organization. So here we can see an actual Idaho citizen who has, in the yellow boxes, if you go in close there, you can see it says militia extremism and domestic terrorism militia extremism. So this was not put forward in the very beginning. This threat assessment and these labels were buried. They were buried deep in discovery. And this person spent 2 years as an accused in a federal prison. That's kind of a big deal. As an accused, not as a convicted of anything, but as an accused. So these labels are used to enhance the punishment through the judicial process.
Before a conviction.
Yes.
And this is the important piece. This is why this is so critical that everyone in America understand this, whether you're on the left or the right. Whoever's in charge of the system, if they don't agree with you here, this is now the tools of weaponizing government are now in the system itself. You can be held for years in pretrial detention while labels like this get buried in your discovery, and the prosecutors can then use that as an excuse to withhold exculpatory evidence in your case so that you can be held in prison for years. And this is a case in point. This particular individual eventually took a plea deal for like $50, a misdemeanor, but had spent 2+ years of his life in prison based on these labels, domestic violent extremism labels, domestic terrorism labels, without clear language in Title 18, 230-31-5, where it does not say who domestic terrorism applies to. Remember that. Again, under the other laws, it's a non-U.S. citizen or a U.S. citizen who are connected to a designated foreign terrorist organization. In this case, this individual was not connected to a foreign terrorist organization, but had these labels applied, lost 2 years of his life in federal prison, and eventually was let out with a misdemeanor of like $50. Crazy, a terrible problem, something we all need to address as U.S. citizens, whether you're on the left or the right. Problem 22, we believe that U.S. citizens, both sides, are being used as political chess pieces to advance this domestic violent extremist and domestic terrorism definitions and designations without being connected to a foreign terrorist organization. This is the National School Board letter in September of 2021, essentially labeling parents showing up to school board members as threats. And these same exact language being used by Merrick Garland just a couple weeks later in his letter, where he refers that we need to deal with these threats to the American system. Again, U.S. actors, domestic violent extremists, threat assessments, threat tags, and what did it result in? Thousands of parents being cited, trespassed, arrested, that data being transferred to the Department of Homeland Security's threat reporting system, and then ultimately that data being aggregated to show that, hey, we need a new domestic terrorism charge with a domestic terrorist organization designation by the Department of State. Is that coming to our organization? This is incredibly dangerous for our nation, for political participation, and we need to do something about it. And with that, I'm going to turn this over to Zoe Warren, who's going to talk about our ideas for solutions.
Okay, I hope that you have really gotten a lot out of this presentation and how dangerous dealing with this issue is. And we would like to offer as the main solution for you in your area, and we're going to just speak from my area. To give you an example, I live in South Carolina, and so we're going to arrange a presentation for the GOP in South Carolina, the delegation, to discuss the P-Wall and P-Wall-G solution. And so we suggest that you do the same for the delegation in your state. Find GOP members that are sympathetic to liberty, that you think would be, susceptible to this kind of discussion. I wouldn't necessarily suggest giving it to every single person in your delegation. Some of them are actually involved in creating the marble cake that is fueling this problem. So first off, on our solution list, we would like to suggest that you talk to your delegation about differentiating between a criminal and an enemy of the United States. You need clear distinction by clarifying that a domestic terrorist is someone who is connected to a foreign terrorist organization that's designated by the Department of State. Next, clarify rules of engagement when law enforcement interdicts U.S. citizens based on the ambiguous DVE and DT definitions and designations right now, because they're doing it right now without a foreign terrorist connection. So we need some rules of engagement immediately. Next, we need to outlaw the honeypot gaslight doctrine, which enables federal agents to essentially radicalize people before they get radicalized by someone else. We'd also like to require federal law enforcement to provide evidence of that foreign terrorist organization designated by the Department of State connection and the threat assessment to state, local, tribal, and territorial law enforcement before any of the resources of the state get used on behalf of the federal government investigations. We would also like to see qualified immunity be forfeited when there is evidence that the foreign terrorist organization and threat assessment are withheld or falsified. Federal law enforcement also need training on new laws clarifying that foreign terrorist organization connection requirements and DVE-DT definitions and designations. We would also like you to amend the laws to make the ITACG, that's the intergovernmental agency, susceptible to FACA, because right now they're not. Also, we need to loosen liability protections for the media and the NGOs who use overlapping federal labels that can result in financial or physical harm to American citizens. It's comparable to any libelous claim. If somebody calls you a murderer or rapist without you being actually charged and found guilty, then they should be responsible. We would also like to see a reform of or repeal of the 1996 Anti-Terrorism Act to include penalizations of the DOJ for Brady violations, restricting the DOJ from withholding exculpatory evidence, and prohibiting the DOJ from seeking excessive pretrial detention. We would also like to see the ability to prosecute DOJ staff who commit Brady violations and loosen the civil liability protections. And I think this is the last note here on our solutions. We want to prohibit the DOJ, prohibit the DOJ Civil Rights Division from threatening local government with lawsuits for not complying with federal reforms. There's a chilling effect that happens when local and county and state agencies are threatened with lawsuits. It immediately makes their lawyers back off and say, we don't want it. And also prohibit DOJ ability for pretrial motions that limit the defendant's introduction of evidence during trial.
And so just to wrap these solutions up, it's really important that that we understand this pipeline flow, right, Zoe and Mila? It's important that we understand this pipeline flow from public confusion of what is a white hate, anti-government, terrorist, extremist, to the media perpetuating the confusion and putting people in harm's way, like labeling Center for Self-Governance far right, without retracting it because their definitions don't match the federal lexicon. And the Southern Poverty Law Center as an example of a non-government organization labeling you without any sort of due process as anti-government, for example, and connecting that to extremism, hate, anti-LGBTQ, far right, etc., and providing that information to law enforcement, to academia, to the public, which they state in their own documents. They provide that to the public, to the media, to law enforcement. What is the self-defense on that? Now, what's worse than the political weaponization of labels is that it turns into the political weaponization of government. The political weaponization of government starts with the definitions. Who does terrorism apply to? According to one law, it applies to people who are non-US citizens. And to other foreign terrorist organization designations, if you're a US citizen and you're helping them, that applies to you and you can be charged. You can go to prison for that. But we're seeing a use of the domestic violent extremism and domestic terrorism labels interchangeably for US actors. And Zoe gave a perfect example, how he was visited by the FBI counterterrorism task force using the domestic violent extremism labels interchangeably with domestic terrorism, not because he was exercising his First Amendment right, but because they were using the labels to see what he had done. Zoe, go.
Yeah, I would also like to submit that this process, this pipeline of the perversion of the image of a U.S. citizen in the public, and also the designation by the federal law enforcement in order to be able to arrest and imprison someone for an indefinite amount of time, what they're not even convicted or even charged with domestic terrorism for that matter. That process, it does extreme damage to the people that it touches, even when they're in prison, because the way that they're treated as enemies of the state is far different than you're treated if you're just your average everyday criminal. There's a problem with, generally speaking, you're only able to be punished if you're found guilty of a crime. We are also, we have this philosophy that you're innocent until proven guilty, but the process that we just described turns all that on its head. And it punishes people apart from due process of law. It causes people to be guilty without adjudication.
Absolutely. Mila, do you have any closing thoughts before we sign off here? I feel that we've done our best to show you the public confusion, the media narrative, the non-government organization labeling, and the political weaponization of government through the ambiguous definitions of terrorism, whether you're a US citizen, a non-US citizen, how that language, the labels are now used interchangeably, and then how we gave examples of the imbalance between the two. And my case to all of you is that it all depends on who's in charge of government and their political disagreement with you, that they now have the tools to use it, not for your safety, but as a political weapon against the United States citizens of America. Mila, any closing thoughts?
I completely agree. This is a nonpartisan issue. This is a systematic issue. And it's just not fair for the full weight and wallet of the American bureaucracy to be able to be used so easily with no sideboards against American citizens.
Well, I just want to thank you guys for participating in this presentation on the political weaponization of labels in government. For those of you who want to check us out, check out centerforselfgovernance.com/PWAL. We are available to talk to you about this matter. It is our sincere desire to ensure that the political weaponization of labels in government does not pervade in the U.S. culture. So with that, thank you all.